The sun became full of light when it got hold of itself. Angels began shining when they achieved discipline. The sun goes out whenever the cloud of not praising comes near. This is about Jean-Paul Sartre, people like that. Never mind. There's a lot about the French in here. The sun goes out whenever the cloud of deconstruction comes near.
All right, welcome everybody once again to my new YouTube channel, Ideologos, where I explore the idea of telling the truth and seeing what happens. On today's episode, I would like to explore the idea of masculinity. There's a lot of talk these days about toxic masculinity, but there's also not a lot of talk about a positive form of masculinity that I learned a lot about in the early 90s. When I came across Robert Bly's funny quote in the beginning about the cloud of deconstruction, I realized I had to say something about this. Because the deconstructionists have infected our universities and the media with the idea that masculinity needs to be destroyed. And to me, that idea is apocalyptic. So I thought I'd speak up, tell the truth about it, and see what happens.
And how would you summarize why men are in crisis now?
I think it's because in a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity. And that's no different than the death of God. It's the same thing. And Nietzsche knew what the consequence of that would be. I mean, that's most of what he wrote about, and so you'd say, well, the divine symbol of masculinity has been obliterated. Well, so then what do you expect? What's going to happen? That means masculinity is going to become weak. And especially if the symbol is also denigrated, right?
Why is society overly feminized?
Well, I didn't ever say that society was overly feminized. So if we're going to discuss my views, we should use my actual words.
Headshot.
I believe that there's a danger in our society at the moment of making the assumption that our culture, for example, is a tyrannical patriarchy, which it is in some small part, and that any active engagement on the part of young men in particular is indistinguishable from an unacceptable power and dominance drive, which I don't believe.
On today's episode of Feminist Fridays, we're going to be discussing the patriarchy, which I think is fitting for Halloween, because it's so scary.
Do you hear that? What the hell is that? Oh my god, is that the patriarchy?
What is the dreaded patriarchy? In the simplest terms, patriarchy is a social system that values masculinity over femininity. This type of social system dictates that men are entitled to be in charge and dominate women, and it implies that the natural state of gender relations is a dynamic of dominance and submission.
Is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friend, then let's keep dancing.
So this is all there is. Dominance and submission. Oppressors and the oppressed. This strikes me as very dualistic, simpleton type thinking, which can only happen if you're aligned with some kind of group ideology. As messy as it was, and like it or not, the most prosperous, most diverse country on the planet was founded on the sovereignty of the individual.
But despite that, and despite the fact that everything works, which is a goddamn miracle of sorts, there is this consistent story that we live in a patriarchy, that it's only oppressive, that it's done nothing but oppress women since the beginning of time, which is also something that just boggles my mind.
It's stopping that woman from joining a STEM field. Oh my god! It's giving that man money! For just being white! little terrifying. Let's get back to coloring.
Men have sacrificed for women and children, including their lives, okay, for thousands of years. You know, yes, there's been brutality, but the brutality is in the minority, okay? Yes, this sick portrayal of human history is nothing but male oppression and female victimage, okay? This is a way to permanently ensure the infantilization of women.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The infantilization of women. That's a hard thing to say. Infantilization. Anyway, I had to look that one up.
In the words of Peter Pan, I never want to grow up.
Can I put it on the fridge? Hooray!
I'm a little and he's my daddy.
The end.
I was surprised to find out that there are actually adults who are getting together in groups to learn how to act like children in their daily lives. And I don't know what the frack else to say about that. So anyway, moving on to a more mature topic, if you're interested in manhood on a different level, I would highly suggest a book written by a good old poet named Robert Bly called Iron John.
What does all of this have to do with poetry?
Well, you know, there's two kinds of men's groups. In one kind of men's groups, you use psychological jargon, which is okay, but those men's groups usually end up complaining about their wives for 3 months and then it stops. The other kind of men's groups in which they use mythology and fairy stories. The fairy stories were in this territory long before us, and when you go into the male area through the fairy story, you find that many men have had this suffering long before you. So therefore, mythology I have found to be wonderful in teaching and trying to teach, to use story and mythology.
Fairy tales in particular?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, they're not connected to any one god. You see, a fairy tale and a myth are alike, but the difference is that the name of the god is not mentioned in the fairy story. So therefore, it's a social form and can be told with jokes or in any way, but it still contains all the energies in their genius.
When a man looks into his psyche, deep underneath the water, in a place no one has visited for a very long time, he finds this ancient hairy man lying there. Man, as we see him today, is a late and uncommon phenomenon, a blip on the radar of human history. Only recently has there been a rapid evolution where all of our animal instincts have become useless, and in order to survive, we must now rely on our conscious mind rather than our unconscious impulses. If we do actually discover this wild man exists within us, what is our first impulse? To lock him up and pretend he isn't there. Parents, teachers, ministers, and principals have been telling us our entire life that we should have nothing to do with him, that we should be frightened of him. When he comes out in school, we medicate him away.
So what that means is that the ideal that man could aspire to is denigrated. And, well, then with your ideal in tatters, you're weak. That's definitional.
Inner gifts do not find their way to creatures without just respect. If a man or woman flails about, he not only smashes his house, he burns the whole world down. Your depression is connected to your insolence and your refusal to praise. That's pretty good. Instead of saying, well, my depression, my father wasn't good to me, Your depression is connected to your insolence and your refusal to praise. Whoa. That is something. Your refusal to praise.
I like the masculine spirit. It's necessary, and it's not fundamentally carnage and pillaging. It's not fundamentally rape culture. It's not fundamentally world destroying. And all of those things all of those aspersions have been cast upon it. That's partly the guilt of Western society for technological progress, even. And those are reasonable challenges to be set before men, but they're not reasonable accusations to swallow without criticism.
As for poetry, Gary Snyder said a wonderful thing. The function of the poet is to find out what part of the mythology is useful in his lifetime. Milton did that. He made the wrong choice, in my opinion. But that's what he did. So therefore, the old connection to the poet with mythology is centuries and centuries old. The poet is not connected primarily only to the lyric poem or the poem of feeling, but he's someone who filters the available mythology. And people have praised me for what I've done with the men. It's nothing but finding a couple of fairy stories that are useful. That's all it amounts to.
Something strange has been happening in the remote area of a forest near a king's castle. Every hunter that goes near this area disappears, never to be seen again. Others are sent to search for them, and they go missing as well. People begin to believe this area is cursed and decide simply never to go there. A hunter shows up one day and asks the king if there is any dangerous work that needs to be done. The king immediately tells him about the forest and warns him of the strange disappearances. This turns out to be exactly the type of adventure the hunter was seeking, so he sets out. The young hunter wanders with his dog into the forest until they pass a pond. Suddenly, a hand reaches up from the water, grabs the dog, and pulls it underneath. As much as he loved the dog, the young man doesn't become hysterical. He simply recognizes that this is the place. He goes back to the castle and rounds up 3 men, and together they return to bucket the water out of the pond. It is slow and monotonous work, but they get to the bottom and discover a large man covered in hair from head to toe. His hair is reddish like rusty iron, so they give him the name Iron John. They take him back to the castle where he is immediately imprisoned by the king, who then gives the key into the care of the queen.
So the Iron John story is about taming the wild man. But not just taming him, utilizing the strength and the carnal spirit and power and goodness of that raw, natural, masculine energy. So I want to thank you all now, if you've gotten this far, for listening and for being a part of this journey as I learn how to make videos and express myself. I know I'll get better with your help. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments. And I will be trying to make 2 videos a week. And if you like what you see, please help me out and subscribe and push the like button. And as always, more will be revealed. But don't go away just yet.
What is a masculinity we can aspire to?
Well, it's responsibility fundamentally, and it's to put it symbolically is that your responsibility is to incarnate the spirit of the Logos. That's your responsibility. That's your role in life, and that is independent to some degree in whether or not you accept the idea of a transcendent and eternal reality. Now, I'm not making a case for that or against that. Those things are beyond human understanding. We know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know what happens. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. We know that. That's the story of the 20th century. So we should learn that lesson. And what that lesson is pick up the world on your shoulders and walk forward. Pick up the world with all of its trouble, with all of its suffering, with all of its evil, and move forward with it. And in bearing that burden, learn that you're the sort of creature that can bear that burden and therefore deserving of respect. That's identification with the Logos, and I've never encountered an idea that's better than that, because it's so not naive. It's the opposite of naive. It's like there's terrible evil and there's terrible suffering. It's bottomless. But the human spirit is capable of voluntarily taking that on as a challenge. Well, it's worth a try.